The day Rebecca Slater saved the town of Caldwell Crossing was the same day they decided to destroy her, and she had learned, in the 3 years since, that gratitude was a currency most people spent only when it cost them nothing. It was the autumn of 1883, and the Kansas prairie stretched out in every direction like a bolt of amber cloth unrolled by the hand of God himself, wild and endless and indifferent to the small dramas of the people who scratched their lives into its surface. Caldwell Crossing sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail, a town of maybe 400 souls who had built themselves up from raw timber and stubborn ambition, and who had convinced themselves, in the way that small towns often do, that they alone understood the right order of things. Rebecca Slater was 26 years old, and she had lived in Caldwell Crossing her entire life. She knew every board that creaked on the general store's porch, every face that appeared at the Sunday service, every name scratched into the wooden markers at the cemetery on the hill east of town. She was not what the women of the sewing circle would call pretty in the conventional way. She was something more interesting than that, with dark eyes that caught the light like river water, and a jaw set with the kind of quiet determination that made men either deeply respect her or deeply uneasy. She ran her father's old livery stable after he passed from a fever 2 winters prior, and she did it well enough that nobody could complain, though several of them tried. The trouble with Caldwell Crossing in the summer of 1883 had been a man named Virgil Holt and his band of riders, 6 men in total, who had been working their way down the trail robbing cattle drives and terrorizing any settlement stupid enough not to have proper defenses. 3 towns to the north had already been hit, one so badly that half its population had simply packed up and left. Everyone in Caldwell Crossing had heard the stories, and the fear had settled into the town like dust after a long drought, thick and suffocating and everywhere. What nobody had known, except Rebecca, was exactly when Virgil Holt planned to come. She had learned it by accident, the way most important things in her life had come to her, through keeping her eyes open and her mouth shut when others assumed she was not worth paying attention to. 2 of Holt's riders had stopped at her livery on a Tuesday evening, needing their horses rishad, and they had spoken freely between themselves while she worked, because she was just a woman in a stable and therefore, in their estimation, no more dangerous than the horses themselves. They had talked about meeting Holt at Miller's Creek on Thursday night. They had talked about riding into Caldwell Crossing at dawn on Friday before the town woke up. They had talked about the bank, the general store, the fact that Sheriff Dade was getting old and slow, and that his deputy was a boy of 19 who had never fired his gun at anything but tin cans. Rebecca had finished their horses without a word, charged them fair, and watched them ride out south into the darkening evening. Then she had gone to Sheriff Dade. He had not believed her. He had told her she was hearing things wrong, that 2 drifters talking in a stable did not constitute intelligence, and that he would not be made to look like a fool by chasing ghosts based on the word of a woman who had been spending too much time alone since her father died. He had said it kindly, which was almost worse than if he had been cruel about it, because it meant he did not even think she deserved the dignity of anger. So Rebecca had done what anyone with a practical mind and no other options does. She had gone around him. She had spent Wednesday and Thursday quietly, without drawing attention, talking to the men she trusted. Old Hector Munro, who ran the feed store and had served in the war and still kept his rifle oiled. The Dalton brothers, Thomas and Amos, who ran the mill and were built like the timber they worked with. Cal Jeffries, the blacksmith, who had arms like bridge cables and a temperament that had never once been rattled. 4 other men who she judged could hold their nerve when it mattered. She had told each of them what she had heard, laid it out plain and without exaggeration, and let them make their own minds up. Every one of them had believed her. On Friday morning, when Virgil Holt and his 6 riders came thundering down the main street of Caldwell Crossing expecting a sleeping town and easy pickings, they had instead found 8 armed men in arranged positions across rooftops and doorways, and a warning shot fired over their heads before they made it 20 feet past the water trough. It had not been a great gunfight. It had been, rather, a very efficient surrender. 3 of Holt's men bolted immediately. 2 more pulled their rifles and were disarmed within minutes without anyone getting seriously hurt. Virgil Holt himself had taken a graze on his left arm from a shot fired by Hector Munro that would be talked about in the feed store for years afterward. All 6 were eventually rounded up, bound, and held in the jail until the federal marshal arrived 4 days later to take them north. The town of Caldwell Crossing had been saved. And then Sheriff Dade had told people it had been his plan all along. He had not done it maliciously, at least not at first. He had done it the way weak men often do things, out of embarrassment and vanity, allowing a story to form around him because he lacked the courage to correct it. But as the story spread and grew, and as his role in it became larger and more heroic with each telling, he had begun to lean into it, and then to build upon it. And then, when Rebecca had quietly suggested to a few people that the credit was being misplaced, he had done something far worse. He had started saying she had known about the raid in advance because she was working with Holt. The accusation was so outrageous that Rebecca had initially expected people to laugh at it. She had not expected them to consider it, but consideration had led to murmuring, and murmuring had led to suspicion. And suspicion in a small town in 1883 was a fire that fed itself. Within a week, the same men she had organized for the defense were suddenly uncertain about what they actually remembered. Thomas Dalton had a wife who reminded him that Rebecca Slater had always been a peculiar woman. Amos Dalton found that agreeing with his brother was easier than disagreeing with the sheriff. Cal Jeffries had simply gone quiet, which was perhaps the unkindest cut of all. Only Hector Munro had stood up and said plainly that Rebecca Slater had done what she had done, and that anyone claiming otherwise was a liar. But Hector was old and had always been considered a touch eccentric, and his voice did not carry the weight it should have. The formal accusation was never filed. There was no real evidence, because there was no truth to it. But the informal judgment of a small community is often more devastating than any court could manage. Rebecca had found herself unwelcome at the Sunday service. She had found her livery business dropping off, one customer at a time. She had found women crossing the street when she walked the boardwalk. She had found her name spoken in low tones, with the particular kind of relish that people reserve for someone they have decided is fallen. She had kept her head up. She had kept working. She had kept the livery running barely, because she had nowhere else to go, and because something in her core would not allow her to simply collapse under the weight of their contempt. But she had been lonely in a way that went past loneliness and became something more like a physical ache, and the loneliness was sharpest at night when the wind came down from the north, and the stable creaked around her, and she sat at her small kitchen table in the rooms above it, and thought about all the ways a person could be surrounded by people and still be utterly alone. She had also thought on those nights about Gilbert Ramsey. Gilbert had left Caldwell Crossing 3 years before the trouble with Holt, which meant he had been gone for 3 years before the accusation against Rebecca, and so the tally of his absence when the autumn of 1883 came around was closer to 3.5 years total, though in Rebecca's mind it had always been rounded to 3, because the additional months felt both too long and too short to properly account for. He had been 28 when he left, broad through the shoulders, with light brown hair that the sun bleached gold in summer and eyes that were a peculiar shade of gray-green that changed with his mood. He had been the kind of man who was easy to be around because he never pretended to be something he was not, which was rarer than it should have been. He had been her father's friend, initially, or rather her father's hired man, working the livery for 3 years before her father's health had begun its decline, and during those years he and Rebecca had developed the kind of friendship that forms between two people who work alongside each other long enough, and honestly enough that all the usual social posturing simply falls away. They had talked about everything: books, which he read voraciously despite having had only a few years of formal schooling. The land, which they both loved with the particular intensity of people who understood that they were small against it. The town and its politics, which they had discussed with a frank mutual honesty that would have surprised the people around them if they had overheard. And there had been something else between them that neither had ever properly named, because the timing had always been wrong or the courage had been insufficient, or simply because some things that matter most are the hardest to say aloud. When her father's illness had worsened, Gilbert had stayed on, working without reducing his effort, often doing more than his wages could cover because he was that kind of man. After her father had passed, he had stayed another 2 months helping her get her footing with the business. And then he had told her that his brother in Colorado had written him a letter asking for help with a mining claim that needed working, and that he had been thinking for some time about whether there was more of the world he ought to see before he was too old to see it comfortably, and that he was sorry about the timing and hoped she understood. She had told him she understood because she did, and because she was not the kind of woman who would have asked a person to stay who had reason to go. But she had stood at the livery door and watched him ride out west on his bay mare, and felt something close in her chest that had not fully opened again since. He had written twice in the first year. Short letters, awkward in the way that letters are when the person writing them is not used to the form and is trying to say something that the form does not quite allow. He had said that Colorado was beautiful and hard. He had said that the mining work was honest but brutal. He had said, in a way that could be read multiple ways if you were the kind of person who read letters multiple times, which Rebecca was, that he thought about Caldwell Crossing often. After the second letter there had been silence, and the silence had stretched from months into a year and then beyond, and Rebecca had made herself stop listening for the male writer with the particular intentness she had been applying to that task. Now it was November of 1883, and the world had gone thin and cold, and the cottonwood trees along the creek had dropped all their leaves, and the sky over the prairie was the color of pewter from dawn until dark. Rebecca was in the livery at 6 in the morning, rubbing down a horse belonging to a cattle buyer from Wichita who was the sort of man she liked, practical, direct, not inclined to judgment, when she heard hoofbeats coming hard down the main road. She did not look up immediately. Hard-ridden horses came through Caldwell Crossing regularly. It was a trail town, and urgency was common on the trail. But there was something about the rhythm of this particular approach that made her set down her currycomb and straighten and walk to the wide door of the stable. The rider coming in from the east was covered in 3 days of trail dust, his coat brown with it, his hat pulled low against the wind. He was riding a gray horse that was clearly road-weary, but still moving with the energy of a horse pushed hard by a rider who knew how to encourage the last of an animal's reserves without breaking them. The man sat in the saddle the way men who have spent years on horseback sit, not comfortably, exactly, but as though the horse and the rider were a single continuous thing, rather than 2 separate entities in an arranged relationship. He pulled up in front of the livery, and before he had swung all the way down from the saddle, Rebecca had already known who he was. Gilbert Ramsay looked at her from 20 feet away with those gray-green eyes that had gone more weathered at the corners than she remembered, and the 3.5 years of silence and distance and everything that had happened in between collapsed into nothing at all. "Rebecca," he said. His voice was the same. She had not realized until this moment how much she had been afraid it might have changed. "Gilbert Ramsay," she said, and was surprised to find her own voice steady. "You look like you rode through hell to get here." "Something like that," he said, and he almost smiled, and then he looked at her more carefully and something changed in his expression, a sharpening, a concern that went past the ordinary. "Tell me what's happened to you. I heard some things in Dodge City that I couldn't make sit right in my head." She stared at him. "You heard things in Dodge City?" "Word travels the trail," he said simply. "And some of what I heard about this town and about you didn't sound like anything I recognized. So I rode." She wanted to say something that matched the scale of the moment. What came out instead was entirely practical, which was perhaps the most honest response possible. Your horse needs water and feed. She's been pushed hard. Come inside. He led the gray mare into the stable, and Rebecca pulled water and hay without being asked, moving around him the way she always had, as though the years had not intervened, as though the ease between them was a physical law that could not be repealed by time or distance or silence. She watched him strip the saddle from the mare with steady, unhurried hands and noted the set of his shoulders, the way he looked thinner than she remembered in some places and broader in others, the long pale scar along the back of his left hand that had not been there before. "What happened to your hand?" she asked. He glanced at it. "Mining accident, cable snapped, I kept the hand, which is what matters. And your brother's claim, played out, he said it without bitterness. We got 3 good years out of it. He's got a place outside of Denver now with a woman he met, 2 children already and another coming. He's fine. And you?" He looked at her directly. "I'm here," he said. "Tell me about Virgil Holt." So she told him. She told him all of it, the 2 riders, the conversation she had overheard, going to Dade and being dismissed, organizing the defense herself, the successful repulsion of the raid, and then the reshaping of events that had followed. She told it plainly and without self-pity, the way she told all difficult things, but she could feel as she spoke the accumulated weight of the past months pressing against the walls of her composure, and she had to keep her hands occupied with folding a horse blanket, and then unfolding it, and folding it again so that they did not shake. Gilbert listened to all of it without interruption. When she had finished, he was quiet for a long moment, leaning against the stable wall with his arms crossed, and his expression doing the complex thing that she had forgotten his expressions could do, holding several things at once, anger and calculation, and something softer underneath that she could not quite identify. "Dade," he said finally, with a flatness in his voice that was more damning than any outburst. "He's afraid of being embarrassed," Rebecca said. "I think he genuinely may have convinced himself of his version by now. People do that." "People do that," Gilbert agreed. "That doesn't make it right." He straightened. "Who still believes you, Hector Munro?" "Hector." "The cattle buyer I have in the stable right now, who was in town that week and saw some of what happened. A few others who have kept quiet about it because it isn't worth the trouble of arguing with Dade." "It's worth the trouble now," Gilbert said. She looked at him. The lantern light in the stable was warm and yellow, and it caught the planes of his face, and she was suddenly, acutely aware of how much she had missed having him near, not just the idea of him, but the specific physical reality of his presence, the way he took up space in a room in a manner that felt like safety rather than intrusion. "You cannot simply ride back into this town and fix things, Gilbert," she said, and she meant it kindly as a warning. "These people have made up their minds." "People's minds aren't concrete," he said. "They shift when the ground under them shifts." He looked at her steadily. "And I owe you the attempt, Rebecca. I should never have let the letters lapse. I should have—" He stopped himself, and for a moment something raw moved across his face before he steadied it. "I should have come back sooner. I didn't, and I'm sorry for that." The apology landed between them with a weight she had not expected, and she found she had to look away from him for a moment at the horses in their stalls and the morning light beginning to angle in through the high windows. "You had your own life to live," she said. "I did," he said. "But some lives make more sense with a particular direction, and I took me too long to work out which direction that was." She did not ask him what he meant by that, because she was afraid of what he might mean and simultaneously afraid that he might mean exactly what she hoped, and both of those fears seemed equally dangerous to her carefully maintained equilibrium. Instead she said, "You must be hungry. There's food in my kitchen upstairs." He ate like a man who had been living on trail provisions for 3 days, which he had, and she sat across from him with a cup of coffee and watched him eat and felt something she could not quite name, except that it was warm and alive, and had been absent from her life for a long time. He told her about Colorado, the mountains that made the Kansas sky look small, the cold that came down from the peaks in October and did not leave until May, his brother's family and the house they had built, the particular satisfaction and particular loneliness of mining work which required a man to be utterly focused on a physical task for hours at a time while his mind ran free. He told her about Dodge City, where he had stopped on his way east, and what he had heard about Caldwell Crossing and the saloon there. A garbled version, true, but one that had her name in it in a way that had made him finish his drink and walk out and start saddling his horse at midnight. "Who told you in Dodge City?" she asked. Drover named Patterson said he'd been through Caldwell Crossing in September and heard the story about the Holt raid and a woman named Rebecca Slater who was supposed to have been in on it. He set down his fork. I told him he was wrong. He said he'd heard it from 3 different people. I told him the 3 people were wrong. She felt something ease in her chest that had been locked tight for months. It was not the solution to anything. His certainty did not change Dade's position, or the town's collective cold shoulder. But it was, she realized, what she had needed most and had not known she needed to be believed by someone who knew her, simply and completely, without qualification. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me for believing the truth," he said. "That's not a favor, that's just basic decency." He paused. "What I want to know is what you want to happen, not what I think should happen. What do you want?" Nobody had asked her that. In all the months of the dispute, of defending herself and being disbelieved and carrying on regardless, nobody had sat across from her and asked what she, Rebecca Slater, wanted the outcome to be. She considered it properly, turning it over the way you turn a stone to see what's underneath. "I want people to understand what actually happened," she said slowly. "Not for my pride. I want it because the truth matters. Because if Dade is allowed to keep rewriting events for his own convenience, he'll do it again, and eventually it will cost someone something real. I want his version corrected before it calcifies into history, and I'm stuck carrying a lie for the rest of my life in this town." "That's a reasonable want," Gilbert said. "It's also possibly impossible." "Possibly," he agreed. "Let's see." He spent the rest of that day doing what he did in the natural way he had always had of doing things, quietly, methodically, without announcing his intentions. He was known in Caldwell Crossing. He had lived there 3 years, which was long enough to have made genuine connections, and to have earned the particular kind of regard that comes from being consistently reliable over time. He went to the feed store and talked to Hector Munro for 2 hours. He went to the blacksmith's and talked to Cal Jeffries, who had the decency to look uncomfortable when Gilbert laid out what he knew and what he had heard on the trail. He stopped in at the general store and talked to its owner, a methodical man named Byrne Pratt who had always been more interested in facts than in narratives. Rebecca watched none of this directly. She ran the livery. She tended the cattle buyer's horse and the 2 other animals she was boarding. She repaired a harness that needed attention. But in the way of a small town, she heard things anyway. A word from Hector's wife when she came by for the horse she boarded there. A look from Byrne Pratt's apprentice who passed on the street. She heard that Gilbert Ramsey had come back and was asking questions. She heard that the questions were making certain people uncomfortable. She heard specifically that Sheriff Dade had sent word asking Gilbert to come by the jail and have a conversation. She was in the upper half of the livery, storing hay, when Gilbert came back in the early evening. She looked down at him from the hayloft and he looked up at her, and she could read from his expression that the conversation with Dade had not gone simply. "What did he say?" she called down. "Come down and I'll tell you properly," he said. She climbed down the ladder and stood before him in the warm, dusty air of the stable with hay in her hair that she brushed away without self-consciousness, and he told her. Dade had not been conciliatory. He had been, in Gilbert's assessment, a frightened man trying very hard to look like an unfrightened one, which was worse. He had told Gilbert that Rebecca Slater had been stirring up trouble since her father passed, and that her isolation had affected her judgment, and that Gilbert would be wise, as someone who knew her, to encourage her to accept the situation rather than continuing to agitate against the town's understanding of events. He had said this with the particular authority of a man who wore a badge, and believed the badge conferred a kind of permanent rightness to his perspective. Gilbert had told him with courtesy but without any softening whatsoever that he was lying, and that he knew it, and that other people were beginning to know it too, and that a man in his position ought to consider very carefully what it cost to maintain a lie that was already starting to develop cracks. Dade had told him to get out of his office. "He'll double down," Rebecca said when he had finished. "That's what he'll do. He'll feel threatened and he'll make more noise about me to try and drown out the questions." "I know," Gilbert said, "but Cal Jeffries is the linchpin. He was there. He knows exactly what happened. And I think he's close to done with carrying someone else's lie on his conscience. Cal Jeffries hasn't looked me in the face in 4 months. He didn't look me easily in the face today either," Gilbert said. "But there's a difference between a man who's abandoned you because he believes the bad story and a man who's avoided you because he doesn't. Cal knows what he did and what he didn't do. I think he just needed someone to tell him that the cost of speaking up is less than the cost of staying quiet." She wanted to believe that. She was not certain she did. But she had already learned in the past 3.5 years to hold uncertainty without letting it paralyze her, so she held it now and said, "You can stay in the room my father used to use. It's not much, but it's dry and it's warm." Something moved through his expression. "I don't want to impose on your space, Rebecca." "You're not imposing," she said, and meant it in more ways than she examined right then. "You rode 3 days because of me. The least this place can offer is a roof." He accepted with a nod, and she showed him the small room off the back of the stable building, which she had kept clean in the way she kept everything clean out of habit and because disorder made her mind feel ragged. There was a cot, a washstand, a small iron stove that needed wood. She had wood. She brought some and he built a fire with the quick economy of a man comfortable with outdoor tasks, and she stood in the doorway watching the flames catch, and thought that it was strange and entirely natural at once to have him back under the same roof. "Gilbert," she said, and he looked over his shoulder at her from where he was crouched at the stove. "Why did you really come back?" "The whole truth." He was quiet for a moment, adding another piece of wood, watching the fire find its hold. Then he straightened and turned to face her, and the firelight made the room small and warm around them both. "Because I heard your name connected to something wrong and I could not stay where I was," he said. "That's the simple answer." He paused. "The longer answer is that I've been having a recurring conversation with myself for the better part of 2 years about whether I was a fool for leaving, and what I was actually running toward versus what I was running from. And I hadn't come to any satisfying conclusions. And then someone said your name in Dodge City with an accusation attached to it, and every confused thing I'd been thinking about for 2 years suddenly became very clear." She was quiet. The fire crackled between them. "What became clear?" she asked, though her heart was already telling her. "That I should be here," he said simply. "With you. If you'll have me in any capacity, I should be here." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had come back riding hard because her name had been spoken wrongly, who had sat at her table and eaten her food, and asked what she wanted rather than telling her what she ought to want, who had worked beside her father and beside her, and known her in the specific complete way that only comes from years of honest proximity. "You are a frustrating man, Gilbert Ramsay," she said, "for waiting this long to say that." "I know," he said, with a remorse that was also something better than remorse, an acknowledgment without excuse. "I'll have you," she said, "in every capacity if that's what you're asking." He crossed the small room in 2 steps and she did not move away, and when he took her face in both his hands with the careful deliberateness of a man who understands that some things, once done, change everything, and looked at her as though seeing her clearly for the first time even though he had known her face for years, she felt the thing in her chest that had closed the day he rode west open again fully and without reservation. He kissed her gently as though asking a question, and she answered it without hesitation, and in the small, warm room above the livery, with the Kansas wind pressing at the walls and the fire speaking softly to the darkness, something that had been incomplete for a long time was finally resolved. The next morning, Cal Jeffries came to the livery. Rebecca saw him through the window before he knocked, and she stood very still for a moment watching his broad back and his shuffling feet, and the hat he was turning in his hands with the restlessness of a man who has been arguing with himself for some distance, and arrived at the door still uncertain of the final word. She went down and opened the wide stable door and looked at him. He was a big man, Cal, with a face that was not made for subtlety. Every emotion he had registered plainly whether he wanted it to or not. Right now he looked like a man carrying something heavy who had finally decided to put it down. "Miss Slater," he said, using the formal address he had always dropped in the years of their easy acquaintance, and that he was using it now told her something about the weight of what he had come to say. "I owe you an apology that's long overdue." "Come in, Cal," she said, and stepped back. He came in, and Gilbert came down from the upper part of the stable where he had been working, and the three of them stood in the morning light filtering through the open doors, and Cal Jeffries said what he had come to say. He had been there. He had been one of the 8 men Rebecca had organized. He had stood on the roof of the hardware store with his rifle and watched the defense work exactly as she had planned it, and felt at the time a straightforward admiration for the clear thinking that had gone into the arrangement. He had said nothing against her in the weeks after, had not actively supported Dade's story, but his silence had been consent in its way, and he knew it, and he had been living with the knowledge of it like a stone in a boot that could not be removed. Gilbert had come to the blacksmith's yesterday and spoken to him without accusation, but with a directness that had made it impossible to keep pretending the stone was not there. "I'll say publicly what I know to be true," Cal said. "I should have done it from the start. I was worried about Dade and what it might mean for my business if he took against me, and that was cowardly. I'm sorry for it." Rebecca looked at him for a long moment. She thought about all the months of cold shoulders and cross streets and lonely evenings, and she thought about how much easier those months would have been if Cal Jeffries had spoken up the way Hector Munro had. She felt a complicated mixture of things: relief, residual hurt, and a pragmatic understanding that people are rarely as simple as their worst choices. "I accept your apology," she said, "and I'm grateful you're willing to say it publicly. That matters more than the apology itself right now." He nodded with the particular gravity of a man who has been given more grace than he expected, and is trying to honor it properly. Over the next 4 days, things moved in the way that truth moves when it is finally given room to breathe, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. Cal Jeffries spoke to 3 of the men at the saloon, not dramatically but plainly, saying what he had seen and what he had not seen, and what he knew and what he did not know but suspected. Hector Munro, who had never stopped saying what he believed, found himself suddenly being listened to more carefully by people who had previously dismissed him as eccentric. The cattle buyer from Wichita, whose name was John Everett, and who turned out to be a man of some standing who knew several people in the county seat, wrote a letter to the district marshal's office describing what he had witnessed during his time in Caldwell Crossing. Gilbert worked through all of it with the patient, methodical energy of a man who understood that you did not move a mountain by attacking it directly, but by removing the rocks around its base until it settled into a different position under its own weight. He did not argue loudly. He did not make accusations or threats. He simply continued to be present, asking questions, connecting people who had similar knowledge, making it clear by his continued presence that he was not going anywhere, and that the matter was not going away either. Rebecca watched all of this with an emotion she was still learning to properly name. She had been alone in this fight for so long that having someone beside her was in itself almost disorienting. Not because she needed him to fight her battles, but because the simple fact of not fighting alone changed the nature of the fight entirely. It was like the difference between carrying a heavy load solo and carrying it with someone walking beside you. The weight was the same, but the distribution of it was different, and the difference was everything. She and Gilbert had, in those 4 days, found their way back into the old ease of being together, with the addition now of something new layered over the old familiarity. In the evenings after the day's work was done, they sat at the table in her kitchen above the stable and talked the way they had always talked about everything, about nothing, with the comfortable honesty that had been the foundation of their friendship from the beginning. But now there were touches, his hand on her shoulder when he moved past her, her fingers catching his briefly when she handed him a coffee cup, the new awareness of being near each other that had not existed in quite this form before. He told her more about his years away. The Colorado winter that had been so severe that the creek outside his brother's cabin had frozen solid from November to March. The morning he had seen the sun come up over the Rockies from a high camp and felt simultaneously very small and very privileged, which he said was the specific combination that the mountains specialized in producing. The long evenings in the mining camp when the work was done, and the other men talked about their families and their towns, and he had found himself thinking about a stable in Kansas, and a woman who folded and unfolded horse blankets when she was trying not to show what she was feeling. "You noticed that," she said. "Of course I noticed that," he said. "I noticed everything about you. I was just slow about doing anything useful with the noticing." She told him about the years since her father's death, the livery and its management, the Holt situation as she had lived it from the inside, the slow erosion of her standing in the community, and the more painful erosion of what she had thought she knew about her neighbors and what their regard was worth. She told him about the nights that had been difficult in the particular colorless way that grief and isolation produce, and she told him this without drama because she had never been a dramatic person, but she could see him absorbing it and she could see what it cost him to hear it. "I should have been here," he said. "You couldn't have known," she said. "No. But I should have been here anyway for different reasons, and then I would have been here for this reason too when it came." He looked at her. "That's the part I keep coming back to." She leaned across the table and covered his scarred hand with hers. "You're here now," she said. "That's not nothing." On the 5th day after Gilbert's return, something happened that none of them had anticipated. Sheriff Dade, who had been increasingly agitated by the shifting ground of the town's opinion, and the continued presence of Gilbert Ramsey asking inconvenient questions, made a mistake. He made it in public, at the general store, in front of Bern Pratt and 3 other townspeople who had no particular stake in the conflict, and no reason to take Dade's side against the plain evidence of their own senses. He was nervous and cornered feeling, and he said, loudly enough for everyone in the store to hear, that Rebecca Slater was a dangerous woman who had been causing trouble since before the Holt business, and that anyone who was going to take her word over his word was being fooled by a calculating female who had always thought she was better than her station. The particular phrase, "better than her station," was the stone that broke the wagon wheel. Bern Pratt, who was a deliberate man and not given to impulsive responses, set down the sack of flour he was holding, looked at Dade with an expression of flat disapproval, and said that in his experience, Miss Slater was about as calculating as his fence post and considerably more useful, and that a man who could not tell the difference between a woman acting out of community spirit and one acting against it had no business wearing a star. It was not a dramatic speech. It was quiet and direct, and it was delivered in the tone of a man who has made up his mind about something and is not interested in argument. But the 3 other people in the store heard it, and by nightfall half the town had heard it, and the particular detail of what Dade had said, "better than her station," had passed through the community in the way that things pass that confirm a suspicion people have been sitting with for a while without being able to articulate it. Hector Munro came by the livery that evening with a bottle of whiskey and a grin that folded every line in his old face into something approaching joy. "The tide's turning, girl," he said to Rebecca. "Dade made himself look like a frightened fool today, and Caldwell Crossing has about as much patience for frightened fools as it does for genuine ones." Gilbert poured 3 cups and they sat in the warm kitchen, and Hector told stories about the town before Rebecca was born, about her father, and how the livery had been built, about the early days when the Kishom Trail was still new, and every week brought something nobody had seen before. He told these stories with the expansive pleasure of an old man who loves his own history and has found a proper audience for it, and Rebecca sat and listened with a fullness in her chest that she had not felt in longer than she could comfortably remember. When Hector had gone, wobbling cheerfully out into the November night, Gilbert looked at Rebecca across the table and said, "We should talk about what happens after." She looked at him steadily. "After what?" "After the town finishes the process of remembering what it already knows." He met her eyes. "What do you want for your life, Rebecca? Not just the next week. After." She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about serious things. The livery, which she had kept running through sheer stubbornness and which she had come, genuinely, to love as her own. The town which had hurt her but which was still, for better and worse, the place her roots went deepest. The future, which she had spent the past months trying not to think about too specifically, because it had felt like a luxury she could not afford while the present was so difficult. And the man sitting across the table from her, who had come back riding hard because her name had been spoken wrongly, and who had asked her what she wanted before presuming to offer what he had. "I want to keep the livery," she said. "And I want to keep living here, because I love this land even when the people on it are difficult. And I want—" She stopped, and her directness, which was so complete in most things, faltered here for just a moment because what she was about to say was large and she was not accustomed to saying large things about herself out loud. "I want what I have right now in this kitchen with you across from me, but permanent." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Then that's what we'll build," he said. "If you'll have me properly, I'd like to stay, Rebecca. I'd like to be here with you, running this place together. I'd like—" Now it was his turn to stop, and she saw the same courage gathering in him that she recognized from her own experience with difficult truths. "I'm asking you to marry me, not because the timing is neat or because everything has been resolved the way it should be, because I love you and I have loved you since before I was sensible enough to know what to do about it, and I don't want to go another day without making that plain." The kitchen was very quiet. The wind outside was a low, continuous note against the walls. The fire in the stove breathed gently. "Yes," Rebecca said, simply and without qualification. "That is a very clear and obvious yes, Gilbert." He laughed, and the laugh was the most relaxed and genuine thing she had heard from him since he came back, and she felt herself smiling in response with the spontaneous completeness that she had almost forgotten was possible. He came around the table and she stood, and he held her with the steadiness of a man who intends to hold something for a very long time, and she put her face against his shoulder and breathed in trail dust and wood smoke and the particular warm human reality of him, and thought that this was what the word home was supposed to mean. The resolution of the public question about Rebecca Slater did not come in a single dramatic moment, but in the way most actual resolutions come piece by piece, untidily, with some people coming around fully and some only partially and some not at all. That last category was small, but it existed, and Rebecca had made her peace with it because she was a practical woman, and she understood that you cannot change every mind, and that attempting to do so is a waste of energy that could be better spent on the people and things within your actual reach. The district marshal's office, prompted by John Everett's letter, and by the increasingly complicated picture it was receiving from Caldwell Crossing, sent a representative to the town in the second week of November. He was a trim, efficient man named Deputy Marshal Cord Atchison, who wore his authority lightly, and asked his questions with the methodical patience of someone who has learned that the truth is generally less dramatic than either side claims and correspondingly more durable. He spoke to Cal Jeffries, who said plainly what he had seen and organized his own role in the defense, and what credit he believed was due to whom. He spoke to Hector Munro, who said the same things he had always said but with increased emphasis and visible pleasure at finally being asked by someone with official standing. He spoke to 3 other men who had been part of the defense, and who, with Cal Jeffries having broken cover, found it considerably easier to say what they knew. He spoke to Rebecca herself for close to an hour, and he listened to her account with the focused attention of a man who is measuring the consistency and credibility of a story against his own accumulated experience of stories true and false. When she had finished, he had thanked her and made extensive notes and said nothing that she could draw specific conclusions from. He spoke to Sheriff Dade last, behind the closed door of the jail office, and whatever was said in that conversation, the sound of Dade's voice raised at several points was clearly audible through the wall to anyone standing nearby, which several people happened to be. Deputy Marshal Atchison left the following morning. He left without making any public statement. But the fact of his visit, and the fact of who he had spoken to and in what order, was itself a statement that the town parsed with considerable sophistication. 2 weeks later, word came from the county seat that an inquiry had been formally opened into the circumstances of the defense against the Holt raid and the subsequent attribution of credit. It was not a criminal proceeding against Dade. There was no law exactly against a man reshaping a story to his own advantage, but it was official acknowledgement that the story as it stood had significant holes in it, and that the holes mattered. Dade did not wait for the inquiry to conclude. In early December of 1883, he announced his intention to retire from the position of sheriff due to what he described as health concerns, which was a face-saving construction that the town accepted without forcing him to be more specific because Caldwell Crossing, like most small communities, preferred a story it could work with over one that required uncomfortable public confrontation. He was replaced on a temporary basis by his deputy, young Tom Haskell, who was 19 and inexperienced, but who had the considerable advantage of not having lied to anyone about anything. Rebecca received no formal apology from the town. There was no mechanism for such a thing, no ceremony of contrition that could fully account for 4 months of cold shoulders and whispered accusations. What she received instead was the gradual, unannounced return of ordinary human warmth. People stopping to talk to her on the boardwalk again, customers returning to the livery, an invitation to the Christmas social from the organizer who had pointedly not included her the year before. These were small things. They were also not small things. She accepted them for what they were, imperfect and sufficient. She also received, in the last week of November, a visit from Thomas Dalton, who came without his brother and stood at the livery door turning his hat in his hands in a manner she recognized as the posture of guilt, and said that he had not treated her fairly and that he was sorry. She looked at him and thought about what it cost a man of his particular pride to say those words, and decided that the cost was genuine and that the words therefore meant something. "I know you're getting married," Thomas said, with the awkward change of subject of a man anxious to move past the hard part. "To Ramsey, congratulations on that." "Thank you, Thomas," she said, and meant it. The wedding was not a grand affair. It was held on the first Saturday in December, 1883, in the small church at the north end of town, and it was officiated by the minister Reverend Gray, who had been among the first to look through Rebecca rather than at her during the difficult months, and who made his officiating now an act of something approaching penance, which she accepted graciously, because she believed in people's capacity to be better than their worst moments. She wore her best dress, which was blue, and had her hair done by Hector Munro's wife Agnes, who had the most skillful hands in town with a hairpin, and who cried through the entire process with the open-hearted emotionality of a woman who had believed in Rebecca steadily, and was vindicated in loving her. The The stable was decorated by Hector himself with pine boughs and red ribbon that he had ordered from the general store without telling anyone why, so that the discovery of it that morning was genuinely surprising and genuinely touching. Gilbert stood at the front of the church in the best clothes he owned, which were clean and pressed but still clearly the clothes of a working man. And when Rebecca came up the aisle on Hector Munro's arm, because her father was gone, and Hector was the nearest thing to a second father the town had given her, Gilbert looked at her with an expression that was so transparently full of love and relief and certainty that several people in the pews had to look away the way you look away from something bright. She stood beside him, and they made their promises to each other, and the promises felt, to Rebecca, not like the beginning of something new, but like the acknowledgement of something that had already been true for longer than either of them had formally admitted. Reverend Gray said the words and Gilbert took her hands, and they were married in front of 40 people, including Cal Jeffries, who stood in the back pew and looked at the floor a great deal, and young Tom Haskell, who had come in his deputy's star and seemed genuinely moved, and John Everett, the cattle buyer who had ridden back to town specifically for the occasion, and who brought a bottle of good whiskey as a wedding gift, which Gilbert appreciated enormously. Afterward there was a gathering at the livery, which had been swept and strewn with hay and lantern-lit, until it was warm and beautiful in the plain, honest way that working spaces are when people bring celebration into them. Agnes Munro and 2 other women had made food that appeared from nowhere and was abundant and good. Someone produced a fiddle, and someone else produced a harmonica, and the music was rough but entirely joyful. And Rebecca danced with Gilbert in the center of the stable floor while the horses watched from their stalls with the mild equine bafflement that always accompanies human revelry. She danced with Hector too, and with young Tom Haskell, who was a surprisingly graceful dancer for a 19-year-old who claimed never to have danced before. And she stood for a while near the door with Gilbert's arm around her waist and his chin near her temple, and watched her neighbors being happy in her space, and thought that this was what she had wanted without having fully known that she wanted it. The first winter of their marriage was cold even by Kansas standards, with snow coming early in December and staying through March in a way that made the prairie look like an entirely different country, silent and white, and reduced to its essential geometry. They ran the livery together in the way Rebecca had imagined, with an ease that confirmed what she had always suspected, that their working rhythms were naturally complementary, that Gilbert's patience balanced her efficiency, that her detailed knowledge of the business balanced his broader physical strength, that they argued constructively about the small things and agreed without effort on the things that mattered. He was extraordinarily good with horses, in the particular way that goes past training and into something like communication, and he brought to the livery a reputation that spread along the trail faster than she had expected. Men who had heard that the Slater livery in Caldwell Crossing had a man who could settle difficult horses began stopping specifically for that service, and within 4 months the business had more work than it had seen in 2 years. Rebecca expanded into buying and selling horses directly in the spring, traveling twice to horse markets in Wichita with Gilbert and negotiating purchases with the frank practical expertise that had always been her natural mode, and that the horse traders, after initial skepticism, came to respect because she was consistently right about the animals she chose and consistently fair about the prices she offered. It was not unheard of for women to participate in such commerce, but it was still unusual enough that she drew attention, and she handled the attention the same way she handled all attention, by being so demonstrably competent that it stopped being relevant. In the spring of 1884, she discovered she was pregnant. She told Gilbert on a Tuesday morning in April when the cottonwoods along the creek were putting out their first leaves and the air smelled of mud and green things and possibility. She told him in the kitchen over coffee, plainly and without preamble, because she had thought about how to tell him and decided that anything except plain and direct would feel wrong between them. He put his coffee cup down and looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had not seen on him before, something open and unguarded and slightly staggered, as though the fact of it was so large that it needed a moment to arrive completely. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He reached across the table. They were always reaching across tables toward each other, she thought. It was the defining physical gesture of their life together, and took both her hands in his and held them with a care that was also full of something that did not have a name that she knew of, though she thought it was probably closer to awe than to anything else. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you? What do you need?" "I need you to stop looking at me like I might break," she said with affection. "I'm the same person I was 5 minutes ago." "You're considerably more than that," he said, and his voice was thick in a way that she had never heard from him before, and that undid her considerably more than she had expected. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she did not cry now, but she held his hands very tightly, and they sat in the spring morning with the window open, and the sound of the creek coming in on the breeze, and the specific reverent quiet of two people who understand that something has shifted fundamentally and irreversibly, and that the shift is good. The pregnancy was straightforward in the way that some are, which is to say it was physically demanding and occasionally frightening, and entirely normal. She continued to work at the livery through the summer and into the early autumn, adjusting what she did as her body required adjustments, and Gilbert hovered with an attentiveness that was simultaneously touching and sometimes maddening, and they had their first real argument about whether she was working too hard, which was resolved in the way most of their arguments were resolved, by Rebecca demonstrating with clear evidence that she was perfectly well and capable of determining her own limits, and Gilbert acknowledging the evidence while reserving the right to worry privately, which she allowed. Agnes Munro came by regularly and was the nearest thing to a maternal presence that Rebecca had available, her own mother having passed when she was very young. Agnes brought food and opinions with equal generosity, and Rebecca accepted both because Agnes's food was excellent and her opinions, while voluminous, were rooted in genuine love. The baby arrived in December of 1884, on a night when the first hard freeze of the season was laying itself over the prairie, and the stars outside were the cold, brilliant stars of deep winter. He was born before dawn in the bedroom above the stable, delivered by the town's physician doctor, Aldrich, and attended by Agnes, while Gilbert waited downstairs in the stable with the horses, and Hector sat beside him on a hay bale, and told him that waiting was the hardest work there was, and that it would be over soon. When Dr. Aldrich came down and told Gilbert he had a son, Hector Munro slapped his knee and let out a sound of pure satisfaction, and Gilbert went up the stairs 3 at a time. Rebecca was tired in a way that went past anything she had previously understood tiredness to mean, and she had never in her life felt anything as complete as holding her son for the first time. He was red-faced and furious at the indignity of his entrance into the world, and she thought he had Gilbert's eyes already, which might have been her wishful thinking but felt true. Gilbert sat beside the bed and looked at his son and wife with the expression of a man who is trying to hold too many feelings at once and is succeeding anyway, and he reached out and very gently touched the baby's cheek with one finger, and the baby turned toward the touch with the instinctive rooting motion of the very newly born, and Gilbert looked up at Rebecca with eyes that were wet and made no attempt to apologize for it. "What do we call him?" he asked. They had discussed names. They had a list. But looking at the baby now, Rebecca knew which name fit. "Henry," she said. "After my father." Gilbert nodded, and his face did something complicated, and he said, "Henry Ramsay," in a voice that made the name sound like something worth carrying. Henry Ramsay was, it must be said, a demanding infant and an extravagantly loved one. He was cared for through the nights with the shared and practical partnership that characterized everything his parents did. They arranged themselves so that each could sleep and work, and neither was chronically undone by the sleeplessness. And they managed the winter and the baby and the livery simultaneously, with a competence that made their neighbors look at them, with the particular admiring attention that genuine partnership produces in an era when it was not universally available. Hector Munro, who had no grandchildren of his own, adopted Henry as a surrogate grandchild with a thoroughness that surprised everyone, including himself. He was at the livery 3 times a week and held the baby with the careful gravity of a man holding something sacred, and talked to him with the easy, rambling verbosity he brought to everything. And Agnes looked on with the particular fondness of a woman who has watched her husband find a new joy in the later years of their life together. In the spring of 1885, young Tom Haskell, who had been doing well enough as temporary sheriff that the position had been formalized by the county, came by the livery on a sunny April morning and told Rebecca and Gilbert that the district inquiry into the Holt situation had concluded. Its report, which had been circulated to the county offices and filed in the official record, stated plainly that the defense against the Holt raid had been organized and executed by Rebecca Slater in conjunction with several male citizens, that this fact had been improperly attributed elsewhere in the immediate aftermath, and that the original attribution was to be corrected in the county historical record. It was not a dramatic announcement. The document was dry and official and used the language of bureaucracy rather than vindication. But what it meant was that the truth was now in writing, in an official place, where it would not be revised again. Rebecca read the summary that Tom Haskell showed her and handed it back and said, "Thank you, Tom. I appreciate you coming to tell me directly." Tom nodded with the seriousness of a young man trying to carry his responsibility well. "It should have been like this from the start," he said. "I wasn't much good at the start. I'm sorry for that." "You were 19, Rebecca said. "I don't hold it against you." After Tom had gone, Gilbert found Rebecca standing in the doorway of the livery, looking out at the main street of Caldwell Crossing, the boardwalk and the buildings, and the people moving along it with the ordinary purposeful busyness of an ordinary morning on the trail. Henry was in his arms, alert and wide-eyed at 4 months old, looking at the world with the concentrated seriousness of an infant who suspects the world is very interesting and is gathering data. "How do you feel?" Gilbert asked. She considered it honestly, the way she always considered questions honestly. "Like something that was wound too tight has been released," she said, "and like I'm tired of being defined by it and glad to be done with it at the same time." "It doesn't have to define you," he said. "It never did. I know," she said. She turned to look at him, her husband with her son in his arms, the livery warm behind them, the spring air carrying the smell of new grass and the sound of the creek and the far-off lowing of cattle somewhere on the trail. "It was part of my story. Not all of it. Not even the most important part." He smiled at her, and she thought that a smile like his, unhurried and full of specific knowledge of her, was one of the world's better things. Henry was walking by the following spring, which is to say the spring of 1886, and walking was perhaps too dignified a word for what he was doing, which was more accurately described as a determined and largely successful negotiation with gravity that left him on the ground as often as upright, but which he pursued with a single-mindedness that both his parents recognized with amusement as entirely characteristic. He had Gilbert's quiet tenacity and Rebecca's practical relationship with failure. She fell down and got up without distress and tried again immediately, and watching their son apply that same matter-of-fact resilience to the challenge of locomotion was one of the particular pleasures of that spring. The livery had grown. Gilbert had added a second building in the autumn of 1885, extending their boarding capacity from 6 horses to 12, and he had taken on a hired man, a young fellow of 22 named Abe Porter, who had come through on the trail without prospects and stayed because the work was honest, and the wages fair, and the environment, as he once told Hector Munro, was the best he had found anywhere. Abe was reliable and kind, and had a gift with frightened horses that matched Gilbert's own, and the 3 of them worked the expanded livery with the smooth efficiency of people who trust each other. Rebecca managed the financial side of the business with a rigor that she had always applied to numbers. She kept careful records, planned forward, and had negotiated with the bank in Wichita for a credit arrangement that allowed them to make purchases ahead of the market, a small sophistication that put them slightly ahead of other livery operations along the trail. She had not set out to build something larger than her father's operation. She had simply continued doing the next right thing and the next right thing, and the accumulation of them had produced something she was proud of. She was also, by the summer of 1886, pregnant again. This announcement, made to Gilbert on a hot July evening when the whole world was still and amber with the particular exhausted beauty of late summer Kansas, produced a reaction from him that was different from the first time, less staggered, more immediately and openly joyful, as though the first time had been the experience that taught him what this kind of news was worth, and the second time allowed him to receive it fully. He pulled her to him right there in the kitchen and held her and laughed, and the laugh was pure and uncomplicated in a way that made her feel it all the way through. "Henry's going to have someone to chase around the stable," he said. "He's going to need to be able to walk reliably first," she said, and he laughed again. The second child arrived in March of 1887, a girl this time, during a thaw that had turned the main street of Caldwell Crossing into a river of mud and made Dr. Aldrich's arrival slightly more dramatic than either he or the Ramseys would have preferred. She arrived quickly and loudly, announcing her presence with a vigor that made Dr. Aldrich raise his eyebrows and Agnes Munro declare that this one was going to be trouble in the best possible sense. They named her Ellen, after no one in particular, because she looked like herself and no name from either family seemed to fit as well as one that was only hers. Henry, who was 2.5, and in the advanced philosophical stage of development, where he viewed all new developments with deep suspicion, regarded his sister from the doorway with the expression of a man whose complete worldview has been disrupted, and who is not yet certain whether the disruption is welcome. Then Ellen, who had been furious since her arrival, made a different sound, something small and surprising, and Henry tilted his head and looked at his mother and said, with the certainty of a very young child who has just made a decision, "Mine." Rebecca looked at Gilbert over their son's head, and the look they shared was one of those looks that require no language and contain everything. By 1888, Caldwell Crossing had grown, as all the trail towns were growing, or declining, depending on whether they were on the right side of the railroad expansion that was reshaping the cattle trade. Caldwell Crossing was on the right side, as it happened, and a spur line had been laid 3 miles north of town that brought new business and new people, and changed the character of the place in ways that were sometimes welcome and sometimes not, as growth always does. The livery was more essential than ever in this new configuration. The railroad brought people who needed horses, and people who needed their horses boarded while they conducted business in town. And the Ramsey operation was well enough known along the trail by this point that it attracted customers specifically by reputation. Gilbert had taken on 2 more hired hands, and Rebecca had hired a bookkeeper 3 days a week to help manage the records, a quiet, methodical young woman from the new families who had come with the railroad, who proved to be exactly as good at numbers as she had presented herself in the interview. They had also, in the winter of 1887, built a proper house. The rooms above the stable had served them well, and Rebecca would always be fond of them in the way you are fond of a place where important things happened. But 2 children and an expanding business, and the simple fact that they now had the means to do it had made the building of a house feel right. And the house they built was solid and practical and comfortable, 2 stories. 4 bedrooms, a kitchen large enough to actually work in, a sitting room where books accumulated on every available surface, because Gilbert read everything he could get his hands on and had infected Henry with the same habit. Hector and Agnes Munro came for dinner every Sunday without exception, and Henry sat next to Hector at the table and listened to his stories with the rapt attention that Hector had been commanding in audiences of one kind or another for decades. It was at one of these Sunday dinners in the spring of 1888 that Hector made the announcement he had been working up to for some time. He was, he said, thinking of retiring from the feed store. He had built it up for 32 years, and he was 69 now, and his back was not what it had been. And he had a nephew in Missouri who had expressed interest in buying the business. And he and Agnes had been talking about spending more time with their grandchildren, meaning, as everyone understood, Henry and Ellen, and perhaps doing some of the traveling that 32 years of building a business had not left time for. Rebecca looked at the old man across her Sunday dinner table and felt a complicated love for him, this man who had believed her when it mattered, who had given his arm to walk her up the church aisle, who had sat on a hay bale with her husband on the worst night of his life and talked him through the waiting. "The town won't be the same without the feed store being yours," she said. "The town will be fine," Hector said with the cheerful practicality of a man at peace with the world. "Towns are bigger than any one person's contribution to them. That's the thing about places. They keep going. The people change, but the place absorbs it all." He looked around the table, at Rebecca and Gilbert and the two children, at Agnes beside him, who was listening to all of this with the particular expression of a woman who has had this conversation in private many times and is ready for its public conclusion. "What matters is what you leave behind you, and I've left behind me more than I deserve, this table being one of the best things." There was a moment of silence that was not uncomfortable but full, the way silence is when something true and tender has been said, and everyone at the table knows it and feels it. Henry, who was 4 and had been following the conversation with the intense but incomplete comprehension of a child at the edge of adult meaning, picked this moment to say, with complete seriousness, "Hector, can I have your hat when you retire?" The table dissolved into laughter, and Hector pulled off his battered brown hat and put it on Henry's head, where it dropped all the way down to the boy's ears and obscured his view entirely, and Henry wore it with the absolute dignity of a person for whom this was entirely satisfactory. Tom Haskell, who had been sheriff of Caldwell Crossing for 5 years by the spring of 1888, was a different man than the 19-year-old who had stood uncertainly with his tin star watching events. He was too young to fully manage. He was 24 now, steady and respected, and he had proved himself in several situations that had tested his nerve and his judgment. He stopped by the livery regularly, not always for professional reasons, but because he and Gilbert had developed a genuine friendship of the kind that forms between men who think similarly about problems and enjoy each other's straightforward company. He came by on a May afternoon when Rebecca was working in the yard outside the stable, watching Ellen, now a year old, sitting in a patch of sun with the focused contentment of a small person for whom the world is sufficiently wide. Tom told her that a man had come to see him the week before, a man who claimed to be kin to Virgil Holt, who had apparently been released from federal custody the previous year after his sentence was completed, and that the man had asked questions about Caldwell Crossing and about certain people in it. Rebecca looked at Tom steadily. "What kind of questions?" "Not threatening ones," Tom said quickly. "And I told him clearly that there was no question that needed answering here that couldn't be answered by the public record, which is comprehensive and available. He left the next morning. I don't think he'll be back." He paused. "But I wanted you to know, because I think you deserve to know things that concern you rather than have people deciding for you whether you need the information." It was a careful and deliberate thing to say, and she recognized in it the reparation it was intended as, the acknowledgement that once, people had decided she did not need information about things that concerned her directly, and that Tom Haskell, at least, had learned from that history. "Thank you, Tom," she said. "I appreciate it." She told Gilbert that evening, and he listened and thought about it with the steady, methodical quality he brought to everything that needed thinking rather than reacting. "The Holt business is done," he said. "It's in the county record. It's not undoable." "I know," Rebecca said. "I'm not worried. I just thought it was worth knowing." "It is," he agreed. He looked at her. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said, and it was the complete truth, not the partial truth it would have been 2 years ago. She was fine solidly, authentically fine, in the way that comes from having built something real to stand on. "I just want to make sure it stays done." "It stays done," he said firmly. "Holt's kin has no claim here and no standing here, and Tom knows it, and the county record knows it, and we know it." He reached over and tucked a piece of hair back from her face, one of his small habitual gestures that she had grown to love for its specific quality of attention, the way it said, "I see you, you specifically, right now." "It's done." The summer of 1888 was long and golden, and unhurried in the way that some summers are when life is full enough that the days feel sufficient rather than lacking. Henry turned 4 in June and had inherited his mother's dark eyes and his father's inclination toward quiet observation, though he broke the quiet readily enough once he had decided something was worth saying. Ellen was walking by July, staggering between pieces of furniture with the same determined negotiation with gravity that her brother had performed, though with considerably more cheerfulness about the falls. Rebecca had begun something new that summer, a project she had not mentioned to many people until it was far enough along to be real. She had been writing down the history of Caldwell Crossing as she knew it, from what her father had told her, and what Hector had shared, and what she had witnessed herself over 27 years of living in the place. Not a formal history, she made no claim to scholarship, but a record, the kind of record that a person makes when they understand from direct experience how easily history can be miswritten and how important it is that someone be trying to get it down accurately. Gilbert had found the first pages of it on the kitchen table on an evening in May when she had left them out by mistake, and had read them with the attention he brought to all reading, and had looked up at her with an expression she had not anticipated. "This is excellent," he said. "The way you write about the town, it's the town I know. It's real." She had been embarrassed and pleased simultaneously, which was a combination she was not accustomed to. "It may not come to anything," she said. "It comes to something already," he said. "Keep going." She kept going. By the end of the summer she had 40 pages, and by the autumn she had 80, and Reverend Gray, who had an interest in the historical record and who had found his way back to genuine warmth toward the Ramsey family over the years, suggested that, when it was complete, she might contact a publisher in Kansas City who was interested in regional histories. She thought this was probably ambitious, but filed it in the back of her mind as something not impossible. Hector Munro sold the feed store in September of 1888, and the following Sunday dinner was the first at which he had not had the store in the background of his life for 32 years, and he looked, Rebecca thought, lighter, not diminished but released. Agnes beside him was practically glowing. "We're going to see the Pacific Ocean," Hector announced over the roast, with the satisfaction of a man delivering news that has been a long time coming. "By train?" Gilbert asked. "What other way is there at my age?" Hector said with great dignity, and Henry, who had been informed before dinner that oceans existed and was processing this information, asked with the urgency of a 4-year-old encountering a genuinely interesting concept, "Is the ocean bigger than the creek?" "It is rather bigger than the creek," Hector told him gravely. "Is it bigger than the whole prairie?" Hector considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "In some directions," he said. Henry sat back and thought about this for a long moment with an expression of profound intellectual engagement, and then said, "We should go see it too," and looked at his father. Gilbert looked at Rebecca. Rebecca looked at Gilbert. Something passed between them that was amusement and possibility in equal measure. "Maybe we should," Gilbert said. They did not go that year or the year after. There was the livery and the children and the house and the work and the life that had been built, which needed tending in the way that built things do. but it was placed on a list of future things, actual and intended, one of those plans that grows more specific with time rather than fading, which is how you know it is real. In the spring of 1889, the Kansas land that bordered the territory was opened for settlement, and the rush of new people coming through Caldwell Crossing was unlike anything Rebecca had seen in her lifetime. The main street was full of wagons and horses and families with their lives packed into boxes, heading south and west toward a future they were making up as they went. She watched them from the livery door with a complex mixture of feeling recognition of the courage it took, knowledge of what they were heading toward, and a bedrock gratitude for the place where she stood, which was fixed and known and hers. Gilbert came and stood beside her and watched the tide of people with her. "Your father stood in this same door," she said. "He told me once when I was small that every person who came through town on the trail was living a story as large as any story that had ever been lived. That he never stopped feeling the weight of that." "Your father was right," Gilbert said. She leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they stood together in the warm spring morning and watched the future go past on its way to somewhere new. Henry, who was 5 and had reached the age where the world was a source of inexhaustible questions, pushed between them and pressed his nose against the door frame looking out at the wagons. "Where are they going?" he asked. "To build something new," Rebecca said. "Did we build something new?" he asked, with the logical follow-through of a child who does not accept partial answers. "We did," she said. "We built all of this." He thought about this carefully, looking at the livery and the yard and the new building and the house across the way, absorbing the fact of it. "Good," he said, with the satisfaction of a child for whom the world has been momentarily satisfactorily arranged, and went back to whatever he had been doing before the world got interesting enough to require investigation. Rebecca's history of Caldwell Crossing was completed in the winter of 1889. It was 112 pages, written in her clear, precise hand, covering the founding of the town through the cattle trail years, and the coming of the railroad and the small and large events that had shaped the community over 2 decades. She had written about the Holt raid factually and without personal rancor, reporting what happened and who did what with the same clean accuracy she applied to the livery's account books. She had written about her father and the livery's founding, and about the community's growth with the love of a person who belongs to a place the way roots belong to soil, completely, by nature, without argument. She sent it to the publisher in Kansas City that Reverend Gray had suggested. The response came 6 weeks later, written in a businesslike hand that nevertheless contained, even through its professional restraint, a genuine enthusiasm. The publisher was interested. He had specific suggestions for revision and expansion. He believed there was a readership for this kind of local history, which was increasingly understood to be the kind of record that became invaluable once the era it described had passed. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter in her hands for a long time. Then she called down the stairs for Gilbert, who came up from the stable with Ellen on his shoulders. The girl was 2, and had recently discovered that her father's shoulders were the best vantage point in the known world, and had arranged her life accordingly. He read the letter with Ellen's small hands tangled in his hair and his eyes moving down the page with the quiet concentration of a reader, and when he looked up he was smiling in the specific way he smiled when something good happened to her, not performatively, but genuinely with the pleasure of a person for whom her joy and his joy are the same currency. "You're going to do it," he said. It was not a question. "I'm going to do it," she agreed. Ellen, for whom the general mood in the room had registered as positive, and who wished to participate, patted her father's head and said something emphatic in the mixed language of a 2-year-old. And they both looked at her and laughed, and the sound of it filled the warm kitchen and went out through the open window into the spring morning. The book was published in 1890 by the Kansas City House, under the title A Chronicle of Caldwell Crossing, 20 Years on the Kishom Trail, with the author listed as Rebecca Ramsey. It was a modest production, 500 copies, with a plain cover and no illustrations, and it was reviewed in 3 regional newspapers with the respectful if brief attention that local histories typically receive. And it was purchased by townspeople and travelers, and by several county libraries, and by a historical society in Topeka that was beginning to understand that the era of the open trail was closing, and that records of it would soon be the only thing standing between the reality of it and its romanticization into myth. She received a letter from the Topeka Historical Society asking if she would consider writing a broader history of the trail region, with remuneration and the use of their archive. She wrote back saying she would consider it and discussed it with Gilbert over a week of evenings, turning it over from every angle with the thoroughness she brought to large decisions. It would require travel, she said, several trips to Topeka, possibly to Wichita and Abilene and some of the other trail towns. I know, he said. The livery, Abe can manage the livery for a few days at a time, Gilbert said. He's managed it before when we've been away, and I'll be here. You'd want to come sometimes too, she said, because she knew him. Some of the time, he admitted. But not all. It's your project. It should move on your terms. She looked at him across the sitting room, this man who had come back from 3 years away riding hard because her name had been attached to a lie, who had eaten at her table and believed her plainly, and set about rebuilding what had been taken from her without ever making it about his own role in the rebuilding. Who had worked beside her and raised children beside her, and built a life beside her with the steady, purposeful partnership of 2 people who had chosen each other fully and meant it. I love you, Gilbert Ramsey, she said, with the directness that was the oldest and most natural part of herself. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes that changed with his mood and were, at this moment, the warmest she had ever seen them. I love you, Rebecca Ramsey, he said. I have for longer than I was sensible enough to say. In the summer of 1891, Hector Munro died peacefully in his sleep, which was the death he had said he wanted, and which came for him with the particular mercy of a world that sometimes delivers exactly what was asked for. He was 72 years old, and he had lived his full life, and said what he had to say and seen the Pacific Ocean, and had spent the last 3 years of his life enjoying the retirement he had earned with the uncomplicated pleasure of a man without unfinished business. He was buried in the cemetery on the hill east of town, and his funeral was attended by half of Caldwell Crossing and by several people who had not lived there for years, but had heard of his death along the trail network that connected all the old settlers of the region. Reverend Gray said the words, and they were good words, and Rebecca stood at the graveside with Gilbert's hand in hers and Henry on her left side and Ellen holding onto her skirt, and she thought about all the things Hector had given her, his belief, his arm, his stories, his presence at every important table, and she thought about her father too, and about the way the people who shaped you keep shaping you after they are gone. She said goodbye to him in the way she said goodbye to things she loved quietly, thoroughly, and with the acceptance that had always been one of her deepest strengths. She had learned over her 33 years that acceptance was not the same as giving up. It was simply the honest acknowledgement of what was. Agnes Munro stayed in Caldwell Crossing. She moved into a smaller house 2 streets from the Ramseys and came to Sunday dinner without Hector beside her, and the Sunday dinners were different now, sadder in one register, but still full in the other registers, still nourishing in all the ways that matter, because a table that has held love does not lose the echo of it when one of its people is gone. Henry, who was 7 that summer, had taken Hector's death with the gravity of a child who understood that something real had ended and who wanted to understand it properly. He asked his mother serious questions about where people went and why some people lived longer than others and whether Hector had known he was going to die. She answered as honestly as she could, which was all she knew how to do. He had, she told him, lived a very full life, and the people who live full lives are in some way fortunate, regardless of how long they go. Henry thought about this. Was his life full because of us? He asked. She looked at her son, who had his father's patience and her own capacity for the question that cuts right to the center. "Partly," she said, "and we were full because of him, partly. That's how it works between people who love each other." In the years that followed, the story of Caldwell Crossing moved forward as all stories do, not in a straight line, but in the spiraling way that actual life progresses, returning to its themes with new variation, carrying its history into its future, changing and remaining itself simultaneously. The cattle trade that had built the town began to give way to farming and to the commerce that the railroad brought, and the character of the place shifted accordingly, becoming more settled and less raw, more fixed in its identity, and less shaped by the passage of people who were going through rather than staying. Rebecca's second book was published in 1893, a broader history of the Kishom Trail corridor that the Topeka Historical Society had commissioned, and that required, as she had anticipated, several research trips and a great deal of correspondence with people across the region who had their own pieces of the story. Gilbert had come with her on 2 of the trips, and they had traveled together with the easy, comfortable pleasure of 2 people who know each other completely and find each other's company sufficient for any journey. Henry, at 9, had come on one trip and been absolutely transformed by the experience of a city. Topeka was not large by any Eastern standard, but to a boy who had grown up on the prairie, it was enormous and fascinating and alarming in equal measure, and he had processed the whole experience in a systematic way that his parents found both endearing and entirely characteristic. The trail history, as it came to be informally known, received considerably more attention than the Caldwell Crossing Chronicle had, because by 1893 the cattle trail era was understood to be genuinely over, and people were developing a retrospective interest in it. It was reviewed in the Kansas City papers and in a historical journal in St. Louis, and it placed Rebecca Ramsey's name in a context that went beyond the local, which was surprising to her and not entirely comfortable, and also, she admitted to herself in her more honest moments, genuinely satisfying. The livery continued. Abe Porter, who had been with them since 1886, had become indispensable and had also, in the intervening years, married a woman named Clara who worked at the new hotel the railroad had brought to town, and who came to be as much a part of the extended Ramsey family as anyone not blood-related could be. Abe and Clara had children of similar ages to Henry and Ellen, and the 4 children ran in a loose confederacy around the livery yard and the Ramsey house and the town streets, which gave Henry and Ellen the particular social education of children who have good friends nearby. Gilbert, who had always been a reader, had begun in the evenings writing things of his own, nothing intended for publication. He insisted firmly, just his account of Colorado and the mining years, and what the mountains looked like in all the seasons he had seen them. He showed it to Rebecca on an autumn evening in 1892, embarrassed in the way that people are embarrassed about things they care about, and she read it at the kitchen table while he pretended to read something else, and was actually watching her read with the transparency of a man who cannot help himself. It was good. It was genuinely, substantially good. His voice on the page was the same voice that spoke across the table, direct and observational and honest, with a capacity for image that she had not known he possessed until she saw it in writing. She told him so without the softening that he would have dismissed and without exaggeration that would have rung false. "You should write more of this," she said. He looked at her across the table for a moment. "You think so?" "I know so." She put the pages down. "The mountain you described in the chapter about the first winter, I've never seen a mountain in my life, and I saw it reading that." He was quiet, and she could see him taking it in with the particular care of someone receiving information that requires reorganization of their self-understanding. "Maybe," he said. He wrote more. He wrote it slowly and alongside all the other things of his life, and by 1894, He had something that he showed to Rebecca's contact at the Topeka Historical Society, who showed it to a publisher in Kansas City, who published it in 1895 under the title Colorado Hard. 3 Years in the Mining Country by Gilbert Ramsey, to reviews that were warm and readership that was, to everyone's surprise, considerably larger than expected, because it turned out that the specific experience of mining life in the Rockies had not been well documented, and there was appetite for it. The publication of his book was one of the things Rebecca was most straightforwardly proud of in her life, and she told him so directly, and he looked at her with the expression she had catalogued over 10 years of marriage, the one that meant she had surprised him with her precision about his worth, which she always found both touching and slightly bewildering, because his worth seemed to her entirely obvious. They had, in those years, the full and particular happiness of people who have built something real together, and who know it. It was not the happiness of perfect days or absent difficulty. There were difficult days, years that were harder financially when the cattle market shifted, seasons when the children were ill in succession, and the household was exhausted, periods when the weight of management and work and life pressed on them with the persistence of the Kansas wind. But they moved through difficulty the way they did everything, together, with honesty, without performing either confidence or distress for the other's benefit, because they were past the point of performance with each other and had been for years. In 1896, Henry Ramsey, who was 12 years old, told his parents that he wanted to go to school in Topeka. He said it at the Sunday dinner table with the seriousness of someone who has thought about this over a considerable period and has organized his reasoning and is prepared to present it. He had been reading everything he could get his hands on since he was 5 years old, and the school in Caldwell Crossing, which was a good school for a small town, could no longer fully contain what he needed. He had looked into it, he said. He had written a letter to a school in Topeka and received back information about enrollment. He presented this information methodically while Rebecca and Gilbert listened without interruption. When he was done, Gilbert said, "How long have you been thinking about this?" "Since last winter," Henry said. Rebecca looked at her son, 12 years old, with her eyes and his father's steady, patient intelligence, laying out his case at the family table with the complete seriousness of someone who expects to be treated as a reasoning person, and she felt two things simultaneously: the ache of it, because Topeka was far and he was 12, and a deep, clear pride that went past the ache. "We'll write to the school together," she said. "And then we'll all go visit and see it in person before we decide." Henry had expected argument or at minimum negotiation, and the readiness of the response took him slightly off guard. He looked at his father. "Your mother is right," Gilbert said. "We look at it first, then we decide. What we don't do is dismiss the idea without considering it properly." Henry nodded with the gravity of someone trying not to look too pleased too soon, and Ellen, who was 9 and had been listening to all of this with her chin in her hands, said, "If Henry goes to school in Topeka, can I have his room?" And the table dissolved. They visited Topeka in March of 1897, and they saw the school, and Henry stood in its library with its shelves running floor to ceiling in a long room full of winter light, and looked around with an expression that Rebecca recognized as the look of someone who has arrived somewhere they were always supposed to be. She stood with Gilbert in the doorway of the library, watching their son move through it, and she did not need to say anything because Gilbert's hand was warm in hers, and they were reading the same thing in the same moment, the way they had learned to read each other over 14 years of marriage. Henry went to school in Topeka in the autumn of 1897. He was 13 years old, which was not unheard of for boarding school enrollment, and he wrote home every week without fail letters that were detailed and honest and full of his observations about Topeka and the school and the students he was meeting, written in the voice that was his, and that carried both his parents in it in ways he was too young yet to recognize. Rebecca kept every letter. She kept them in a box in the sitting room, organized by date, which was exactly the kind of thing she would do. Ellen, who had gotten Henry's room as promised, was now the daily presence in the livery yard and the house, and she occupied her space with the large personality of a child who had always had to compete with an older sibling for attention and had learned to make herself impossible to overlook. She was funny and stubborn and excessively fond of horses, which in the context of a livery family was perhaps inevitable, and she had the particular combination of her mother's practical directness and her father's patience that made her both formidable and deeply good-natured. Rebecca watched her daughter ride along the paddock fence on the old mare that had been more or less semi-retired to the role of teaching horse, sitting the saddle with an ease that was entirely natural, and thought about all the possible futures available to a girl who was growing up in a world that was, slowly and imperfectly, expanding its sense of what futures were available to women. "She's going to be a problem for everyone who underestimates her," Gilbert said, watching alongside her. "Good," Rebecca said. In the spring of 1899, Reverend Gray retired and was replaced by a younger minister, and the Sunday services changed character in a way that was neither better nor worse but simply different, as things become when the people who define them are replaced by new people bringing their own definition. The town itself was changing. A second church had been built for the new families the railroad had brought, and there was talk of a proper schoolhouse expansion and a new well on the east side of town. The century was turning, and with it something in the nature of the world was shifting, though nobody could have said precisely what it was, just the sense of a tide changing, of one kind of time giving way to another, of the raw frontier becoming something more fixed and permanent, and in gaining permanence losing some quality of wildness that had made it, for those who lived in it, both harder and more magnificent. Rebecca was 42 years old in the last year of the 19th century, and she was not a woman given to sentimental reflection about the passing of time. But she found herself in the evening sometimes sitting with a cup of coffee and looking at the livery from the sitting-room window, the expanded building with its clean lines, and the horses visible through the doors and Abe's light on in the tack room, where he always did his evening work, and thinking about all that had happened in the space between the woman she had been and the woman she was. She had been 23 when her father died, and she took on the livery alone. 25 when she organized 8 men against Virgil Holt and saved the town and was rewarded for it with accusation. 26 when Gilbert came back riding hard from the east, covered in trail dust, and called her name from in front of the stable door. 27 when they married. 28 when Henry was born. 30 when Ellen arrived. 33 when she published her first book. And here she was at 42 with 2 children and a husband and a business and 2 books and a life that was, by any measure she could apply, full. The thing about the accusation about being branded a traitor by the town she had saved was that it had ceased, many years ago, to define her. It had been a thing that happened, one of the hard, true things that shaped a life, and she carried it not as a wound but as a kind of knowledge. She knew what it was like to be disbelieved when you were telling the truth. She knew what it was like to be alone with a fact that nobody would credit. She knew the particular endurance required to continue being yourself when the people around you have decided you are someone else. And she knew, which was perhaps the most important thing, that the remedy for being disbelieved is not to perform credibility, but to simply continue being true, and to hold on until the truth finds its own weight and settles into its proper place. Gilbert came in from the stable at the end of the day and found her at the window with her coffee, and he poured himself a cup and came to stand beside her, looking out at the same view. "Abe's got a difficult one in the middle stall," he said. "Trail horse that came in this afternoon. Took something in his right foreleg about 20 miles out and he's sore and angry about it. Can you help him?" "By morning," Gilbert said. He sipped his coffee. He looked at her profile. "What are you thinking?" "About everything," she said. "About how strange it is to look at a thing you've built and realize it came from things that were hard." He was quiet for a moment. The stable lamp swung slightly in a draft from the open door, sending the light moving across the yard. "The hard things were real," he said. "They don't stop being what they were, but they're not all they were either." She turned from the window to look at him. This man at 44, a little more gray at his temples and a few more lines at the corners of his eyes, with his scarred hand wrapped around a coffee cup, and his gray-green eyes watching her with the specific knowledge of someone who has made a complete study of one person over many years and considers the study well worth the time. "No," she agreed. "They're not all they were." He leaned down and kissed her briefly, and with the easy naturalness of a gesture performed 10,000 times, and she put her hand against his face for a moment before she stepped back. "Henry writes this week," she said. "He does," Gilbert agreed. "I expect he'll have opinions about the new century." "Henry has opinions about everything," she said fondly. "He gets that from his mother." She gave him a look that he received with the mild, unrepentant smile of a man who knows he is entirely right. The letter came from Henry that Friday, as expected, and it was a long one, 3 pages, written in his dense, careful hand, full of his observations about what the new century might mean, and what he was reading, and a debate he had been having with a friend at school about the future of cattle ranching versus the new farming methods that the agricultural colleges were promoting, which he laid out with a thoroughness that made his father nod and say, "He's going to be a professor," and his mother say, "He's going to be whatever he decides to be," which was both more and less specific and exactly what she meant. Ellen read the letter over her mother's shoulder and was moved to write a return letter immediately, which she did at the kitchen table in her large looping hand that was nothing like her brother's, telling him that the new century looked exactly like the old one from where she was standing, and that the difficult horse in the middle stall had been persuaded to accept his treatment and was already better, which Henry would consider relevant, because he had inherited the family's feeling for horses along with everything else. They were Ramseys of Caldwell Crossing, all of them, the boy in Topeka becoming something new and carrying everything old in him, the girl in the livery yard who was going to be a problem for everyone who underestimated her, the man who had come back riding hard because love and truth were both worth riding hard for, and the woman who had saved a town and been branded a traitor for it, and had kept her head up and her livery running and her truth intact until the truth found its proper weight. The prairie around Caldwell Crossing was the same prairie it had always been, wide and amber and indifferent in its magnitude, shaped by wind and light and time in ways that made all human business feel small from a sufficient distance. But from the inside, from the particular inside of a life well and honestly lived, it was not small at all. It was the only size that mattered. On a Saturday afternoon in the early spring of 1900, when the air had the first real warmth in it after the long gray months, Rebecca and Gilbert rode out east of town together, the way they had started doing on Saturday afternoons in the years after the children got old enough not to need constant supervision. 2 people on horseback moving through the prairie without particular destination, talking about everything and nothing in the way they had always talked. The cottonwoods along the creek were just beginning to show the first suggestion of green, and the sky above the prairie was the pale, clear blue of early spring that looks like the world is starting over. They rode at an easy pace along the creek bank, and the horses walked with the relaxed pleasure of animals not in a hurry for the first time in a work week. "Gilbert," Rebecca said, as they came to the particular place on the bank where the creek bent, and there was a wide flat rock that they had come to think of as their place, in the way that married people develop specific places that carry the weight of accumulated time spent in them. He said. "Do you remember what you said when you rode back?" "That first morning," he thought, "I said you looked like you needed telling," she laughed. "You did not say that." "I thought it," he said. "What I actually said was probably something about riding through hell and finding you already there waiting." "You said I looked like I'd been riding hard myself," she said, "which was your way of saying you could see what the year had cost me." He looked at her with the ease of a man who has nothing to perform and no distance to maintain. "You'd paid for something that should never have been charged to you," he said, That cost was real, I saw it. And you came back, she said. I came back, he agreed. And I'd do it faster the next time. If I had the years back, I'd do it faster the first time. She rode for a moment in comfortable quiet, the horses walking and the creek moving alongside them with its low, continuous voice. I'm glad you came back, she said. I'm glad you came back riding hard specifically, because it meant you weren't taking time to work out whether you should. It meant you already knew. I already knew, he said. I think I knew for a long time before I was in Dodge City hearing your name wrong. The hearing it wrong just stripped away everything that had been slowing me down. She pulled her horse up at the flat rock, and he pulled up beside her, and they sat on horseback looking at the creek and the prairie and the wide pale spring sky. Whatever comes next, she said, and she meant it broadly, the next years and the next century and all the unknown particular things that time had in it still. I want to be right here, exactly where we are. He looked at her, and in the gray-green clarity of his eyes she saw what she had seen there from the beginning, the thing she had watched for years and finally named and claimed as her own. A specific, complete, decided love that was not performed or polished but simply true. Right here, he said, is exactly where I intend to be. The creek went on speaking its one long word into the morning, and the horses stood patient under the open Kansas sky, and Rebecca Slater Ramsey and Gilbert Ramsey sat side by side at the flat rock on the creek bank and looked at the prairie that had held all their history and was still holding it, still holding them, in the amber and endless country where everything that mattered to them had been made.